The silence in your medieval village held a different weight, a cold promise that gripped your spine even before the pale dawn broke over the muddy, uneven lane. Wood beams, rough and swollen with damp, framed crooked houses that seemed to lean on each other for support, their thatched roofs sagging under the relentless mist. You felt the unwelcome crawl of fleas nestled deep in your threadbare rags, the original comfort pests, whispering that rest wouldn't come easy today. Outside, the dawn sky was a faded canvas of smudged grays and muted blues, as tired and washed out as the coarse wool wrapping your shoulders. Beneath your feet, the chill of hard-packed earth seeped upward, and somewhere nearby, a rooster crowed, sharp and irritated, nature's monotone alarm clock for a world without snooze. Buttons. If today's smartphone dying in your hand sends you into a panic, imagine your last splinter of firewood sputtering into cold ash at dawn. That was survival's real heart-racing moment. Your day began much like every before, a battle of repetition and slow resistance. The broom's stiff bristles scraped the dirt floor, stirring up dust that mingled with the tangy smoke from the hearth fire. The smell was a punch of charred wood mixed with remnants of something long rotted, familiar and unwelcome. Nearby, the slow, rhythmic grind of the hand mill echoed, a monotonous, trance-like chant. Grinding grains by hand produced just a small heap of flour, often doctored with sawdust, to stretch the meager loaf, a bitter secret behind the dry crumb that shadowed every meal. You caught the distant tolling of the church bells, soft, melancholy beats threading through the morning mist. Time moved with a heavy tread here. Unlike the relentless ping of notifications in a modern city, the tactile scrape of iron against stone filled your hands as you sharpened tools, feeling the grit grind against your skin, evidence of labor that stained your very existence. For a brief moment, you paused, gathering warmth around a communal fire where villagers shared stolen jokes and tired smiles. It was a flicker of companionship in a world ruled by discomfort and dirt, a transient hearthside glow against the vast gray. But then, something shifted. The usual chorus of barking dogs fell abruptly silent, and nearby, an exchanged glance between neighbors carried a wordless warning. The air thickened as shadows lengthened, and the familiar weight of monotony cracked, revealing a quiet unease humming beneath the surface. Whatever was coming next held the village's gaze captive, and it wasn't the gentle lull of routine. Hey, before Morpheus fully pulls you under, take a quick moment to check if you're still subscribed. For some, the button vanished, and I don't want you to miss the next chapters that keep you cozy and curious before sleep. Drop a soft like a pillow's sigh. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Your part keeps this little haven alive. Thanks for being here. The sudden stillness in the village crept over you like a slow, unwelcome fog. The faint rustle of wind through the cracked shutters was now replaced by an eerie hush that seemed to press against your skin, colder than the damp air ever managed at dawn. The usual stirrings, the low murmur of footsteps along the uneven stones, the occasional clatter of pots, the barking of stray dogs, fell away, swallowed by a quiet that hung too heavy, taut as a bowstring, ready to snap. You shifted your weight off the cold earth floor, the thin soles of your boots already soaked from last night's relentless mist. All around, the crooked houses leaned further into one another, as if seeking strength in numbers against whatever invisible threat strained the village's fragile peace. You could almost taste the tension, sharp and metallic, rising from the wet soil beneath your feet. The torchlight flickering against the smoky sky cast elongated shadows of the villagers gathering near the central square. Silent shapes, faces drawn tight with concern. Your eyes caught one of the elders, a man whose beard had grayed with countless winters, mouthing a wordless warning to the others. The heavy bell at the church tower tolled again, slow and sonorous, cracking through the stillness like a distant heartbeat trying to rally a faltering spirit. You pulled your woolen cloak tighter, the fabric doing little to ward off the chill that settled deep in your bones. Glancing down, your fingers instinctively brushed over the worn wooden handle of your tool, once sharpened just hours ago. Today, it felt heavier in your grasp, not because of its weight, but because it symbolized the harsh expectancy now gripping your village, a promise that rest would elude you once more. Small skittering noises nearby snapped your attention to a scared pair of eyes watching from behind stacked firewood. A child, clutching a ragged doll, blinked up at you, silent. The unease was communal, infecting even the youngest. No lullabies tonight, no whispered lullabies to chase away the dread lurking just beneath the surface. Before you could let the atmosphere suffocate further, a sharp cry shattered the gathering gloom. A dog's frantic baying, sharp and desperate, slicing through the tension like a knife. The village froze, breaths caught mid-exhale. Somewhere close, the clatter of hurried footsteps followed, uneven and unsteady, across the cobbles. You turned towards the noise, the torchlight revealing a figure stumbling into the square. Mud splattered on his cloak, and eyes wild with fear. His voice cracked as he gasped out broken words, words that didn't quite make sense, but carried the unmistakable weight of urgent warning. The villagers leaned in, every ear straining to capture the fragments carried on ragged breath. It's the plague coming from the west woods, those cursed travelers. No one escaped. Your heart sank, the dull thud echoing inside your chest. The words settled over you like a shroud. The village's fragile shield of isolation was cracking. The unseen enemy wasn't some distant rumor whispered in taverns, but a creeping darkness right at your doorstep. You heard an old woman's quiet prayer, barely rising above the cold wind, her voice trembling as if trying to stitch a patchwork of hope over the unraveling dread. Yet the fire at the village's hearth seemed to sputter that night, barely catching the moist air. The familiar glow of life and warmth dimmed beneath the weight of impending calamity. Your gaze drifted upwards, catching a sliver of pale moon slicing through the clouds, a lone witness to the unfolding fear. The mist thickened again, curling around your ankles, damp and unyielding, threatening to cling forever. For a moment, you found yourself replaying the mundane hardships of earlier, grinding grain, scraping the dirt floor, chasing fleas crawling deep into worn cloth, and a bitter irony stabbed you. No matter how grueling your daily battles, nothing had prepared you for this slow, creeping death that moved silent and unseen. If the famine and exhaustion were past demons, this was a specter from a deeper, darker place. The villagers began to stir, whispers rippling like a waking tide. Plans half-formed and desperate hung in the cold air like fragile spider threads. The old stories of sickness and death, once relegated to distant tales, now breathed beside you, so close you could almost taste the bitter iron of fear. You stepped forward, the rough stone of the well beneath your palm grounding you. The thought of fetching clean water, rationing what little herbs remained in your garden, shutting doors against the unseen, it all seemed suddenly crucial, both painfully obvious and terrifyingly insufficient. And yet, amidst the murmur of hushed voices and the shuffling feet of wary neighbors, a curious glint caught your eye, a small, defiant spark from a child's wide gaze, refusing to blink away the terror. Like the fragile flame of the hearth, barely holding off the cold, there was a stubborn spark of life, stubborn hope flickering beneath the shadow. Still, the chill was spreading faster than any warmth could catch. The village's walls felt thinner now, more porous. Tonight, you realized, neither the earth nor the sky would offer sanctuary. The old bell tolled again, a slow, mournful knell that seemed to echo through your very soul. With every strike, a silent countdown, drawing the village toward a night from which no one could wake unscathed. And then, as if summoned by the sound, a sudden howl rose from the forest's edge, a long, ragged cry that pierced the night and left every soul holding their breath. The unknown now no longer a whisper, but a roar, inching ever closer. The night clung to the village like a wet shroud, the cold seeping deeper beneath your skin as the shadows thickened. The distant howl had sliced through the fragile quiet, leaving your heart pounding against ribs that suddenly felt too thin for the weight of fear. You pulled your cloak tighter, the fabric no match for the biting damp settling into every nook and cranny. But it was all you had, and all you could offer the trembling child who now clung to your sleeve. Eyes wide with a silence heavier than any scream. Around you, faces blurred into an unholy communion of dread and defiance. The fires flicker, once a warm joke shared among neighbors, now cast ghostly shapes, too restless to comfort. Smoke curled upwards, but tasted bitter tonight, like the ashes of hope smoldering. In the pit of your chest, you could almost hear it, the hush of centuries-old stories folding in on themselves, tales of pestilence whispered through cracked lips, warnings once ignored, now unbearable truths clawing at reality. The villagers moved like shadows themselves, hesitant and taut. The old blacksmith, his hands trembling despite years of forging iron, clenched a rusted hammer as if it could hammer away this menace. Mothers drew children close, swaddling ragged blankets around them, but the innocence in those tiny faces flickered, threatened by the unknown creeping through the woods. You stepped toward the edge of the square, where bleak lanterns swung on iron hooks, their dim glow barely reaching the curling mist that snaked closer, licking stones and boots alike with damp fingers. The air was heavy with cold and unease, each breath a ragged promise. Roots and leaves whispered secrets in the dark, throwing timid shadows that felt less like nature and more like watchers waiting, silent and patient. A sudden crack shattered the tense silence, the splinter of wood under boot heel as someone stumbled, breath ragged. You turned sharply, eyes catching a figure emerging through the fog. The village hunter, once a sturdy pillar of calm, his face pale under a sheen of sweat. Mud streaked his legs, his bare feet thudding unevenly on stones slick with dew. The weight of his news pressed on you instantly, a stone sinking into the well of your gut. "Dead in the west woods," he gasped, voice cracking like dry twigs. Bodies twisted, pale and swollen, no one left. The words hung between. You, raw and unwilling to soften. The villagers leaned in, breaths catching, the chill now mingling with an ache far colder. Even the dogs, usually restless at night, had vanished into uneasy corners, leaving only the creeping howl echoing faintly like a death knell. Your eyes flicked to the church tower where the heavy bell tolled again, slow and deliberate, each clang a heartbeat lost. The sound thrummed through the damp air and into your very bones, a reminder that time sprinted even when the world seemed frozen. The hunter's tale spread like wildfire through quivering lips, the grim details painting the creeping plague as an invincible shadow stalking the village. You imagined it, silent and unseen, writhing between wet branches, seeping into the earth, as merciless as the grinding wheel you had turned hours before, slowly eroding the life you knew. Yet amid the turmoil, a crack appeared in the night's oppressive color, a soft glow from the flickering fire, catching on a young girl's fearless eyes. She stood stiff but steady, clutching a chipped wooden cross. her gaze unblinking in the face of despair. That small, stubborn flame traced a promise beneath the terror, a quiet rebellion against the consuming dark. Your thoughts were pulled back to the hearth, where late yesterday you had swapped worn smiles and hurried jokes with the others. Moments so fragile now, they seemed like a lifetime ago. The stillness felt suffocating, wrapped around you as tightly as the woolen cloak soaked through by mist. Suddenly, the old healer pushed through the gathering crowd, her frame bent but purposeful, her hands stained with herbs and the dried blood of countless failed cures, lifted a battered satchel. Murmurs rippled as she spoke in a voice thin as parchment, but fierce with resolve. She outlined crude plans, the quarantining of the sick, boiling water over borrowed iron pots, and desperate prayers offered alongside strained herbs. You felt the familiar scrape of rough stone beneath your palm, the well's edge grounding your racing mind. Water, clean and life-giving, would soon be a rare treasure. The task ahead swelled with a weight greater than any dawn's labor you'd known. Tonight, and the nights to come, would demand more than calloused hands and quick feet. From the shadow-cloaked outskirts, a dog barked once, sharp, warning, but it was different now, not frantic, but cautioning. The forest churned behind, those crooked houses, its deepest secrets, soaking the soil like poison. You swallowed hard, the metallic taste of fear thick on your tongue, and felt the dark pulse of the unknown pressing at the village's brittle walls. The elders gathered, their whispers threading through fog like fragile spells. The youngest among them, a boy no older than your own trembling shadow beside you, stepped forward with a tablet of faded parchment, scribbling names, marking who could guard or who must remain behind. The night's chill pressed in, but beneath that cold, determination hardened. Yet for all the plans, all the quiet bravery, the creeping shadow beyond the pines was patient and vast, an unwelcome tide drawing near with a slow, terrible inevitability. You glanced once more at the broken edge of moon, pale and silent as ever, a hesitant witness to a village standing at the brink. Somewhere beneath the mist, the howl rose again, longer and more desperate this time, calling the night's dark heralds forward. In that frozen moment, the night itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable strike, the sudden crack where hope would shatter, or perhaps, somehow, bend toward survival. And then, a cold wind swelled from the west, carrying with it a scent that was not earth nor rain, a sharp, bitter smell that clung to your nostrils and whispered of things better left unnamed. The morning crept in, a gray wash over the village that blended mist and cold like a thick shroud. You stepped quietly, boots crunching on damp earth, each sound swallowed instantly by the heavy silence that still clung like a second skin. The sun, if it dared show, remained trapped behind low clouds, its light timid, as if reluctant to witness what was unfolding. Around you, the village stood half shrouded in fog, each crooked house a dark silhouette, outlined by dripping eaves. The thatch moaned softly under the weight of the wet, a weary breath in the cold air. Between the buildings, narrow alleys seemed to twist and close in, like a web tightening around a fly. You could almost hear the pulse of the earth beneath your feet, slow but certain, mirroring the dread tightening in your chest. The old bell tolled once more, slow and mournful, pulling the villagers together like moths around flickering flames. Faces, gaunt and drawn from restless night, appeared at windows and doorways, silent watchers etched in shadow. Children clung to shivering mothers, their wide eyes reflecting the dim light of flickering hearth flames inside. You felt the weight of their gazes, as if each glance was a fragile thread holding back the darkness, pressing against the village's fragile walls. Your hands instinctively clenched the worn handle of your tool. It was no longer just a tool. It had become a symbol of something more, a fragile shield in a world where certainty was unraveling. A low murmur started among the clustered villagers near the square, a restless hum that soon sharpened into anxious whispers. The stories of the hunter's grim report traveled quickly. Twisted bodies in the western woods, the plague gripping them like a cruel hand, dragging death silently through the trees. The wind carried the tale, cool and biting, weaving between the shivering bodies that stood pressed close together, searching for warmth in each other's presence. The scent of smoke mingled with the dank earth, a bitter perfume that haunted the morning. You inhaled deeply, the acrid tang catching at your throat as you thought of the hearth fire sputtering the night before. Hope barely caught in flickering embers, struggling against damp skies. Hope, fragile as a moth's wing, battered by the storm. Nearby, the healer moved steadily through the crowd, her back bent, eyes sharp beneath a scrim of silver hair. Her voice was soft but firm, weaving through the villagers like a thread, pulling them together. She spoke of precautions, of herbs to simmer, of water to boil, of care to be taken in silence. Every word was met with bowed heads and tight mouths, the resolve hardening even as fear gnawed at the edges. The child at your side, clutching a chipped wooden cross, shivered not just from cold, but from the weight of a silence too vast for words. You brushed a strand of damp hair away from their forehead, offering the barest comfort, knowing that soon, even such small acts might not be enough. The earth, moist beneath your feet, seemed to pulse with unseen life, the crawling sickness threading through roots and rodents, winding its way into the veins of the land itself. The forest's edge loomed dark and impenetrable, a guardian transformed into a silent predator. Something ancient stirred among the trees, waiting patiently beyond reach. Voices drifted from the gathering. Fragments of plans dissolved too quickly into uncertainty. Doors would be barred, watch rotations marked out, supplies rationed down to the last precious morsel. The old ways of survival felt both pitiful and necessary. A fragile lattice holding back the spreading shadow. You glanced up, the pale sliver of moon still carving a cold crescent in the sky, its light faint but unyielding. It witnessed the growing tension, the flicker of courage beneath terror, an ember burning against the dark. Suddenly, a sharp cry shattered the rising murmurs. A piercing bark slicing through the thick air. Heads snapped toward the sound, breaths held taut. From the forest's maw came a figure stumbling onto the muddy street. The village trapper, face pale as a sheet, coated in the mud. Of desperate flight. His eyes darted wildly, searching for something impossible to find. Many dead in the forest, he gasped, voice ragged, eyes wild with a horror too fresh to name. Bodies twisted, no one spared. The words hung heavy, a fetid cloak dragging down the spirits of those who listened. The firelight flickered in trembling hands, casting jittering shadows that seemed to grow taller, angrier. The dogs, once brash and barking, now cowered in dark corners, their urgency fading into a wary silence. You swallowed hard, the metallic taste of dread burning your tongue, mixing with the cold that seeped into every bone. The weight of the unknown pressed in, unrelenting as the mist curling at your boots. A sudden wind swept through the village square, stirring the smoke into ghostly spirals that reached up like desperate fingers. The lanterns flickered, casting brief but looping glimmers over the faces of the stalwart gathering. Eyes met, sharing a silence that screamed beneath the quiet. Unspoken fears binding the village tighter than any spoken word could. And there, in the midst of hushed prayers and hurried plans, a single, unmistakable truth settled. The village, once wrapped in simple cycles of dawn and dusk, warmth and toil, now stood balanced on a knife's edge. The creeping shadow was not just a rumor or a story told behind closed doors. It was here, a breath away, unraveling the world you knew in slow, merciless waves. From the distant woods came another howl, longer, more desperate, the sound of hunger and loss entwined. It rippled through the night like a warning, a call, a dark chant heralding the slow, steady march into an unforgiving abyss. And you knew with every fierce beat of your heart that when dawn came again, nothing would be the same. Because this time, the silence before the storm wasn't an empty void. It was the calm of the earth holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. The air hung heavy with a damp chill that seemed to seep into your bones, cloaking the village in a silence that was less peace and more a slow tightening noose. The sky above remained a bleak stretch of gray, the clouds smeared like old ash across a forgotten hearth. Your breath came shallow and visible, spurts of cold mist that vanished quickly, swallowed by the still, uneasy air. Around you, the villagers moved in low clusters, their voices hushed and hurried whispers weaving through the fog like fragile threads. You noticed the way their eyes darted nervously toward the dark line of trees, hemming the village, the forest's edge now a looming maw, silent and watchful. The old bell tolled again, each sonorous clang slicing into the stillness like a reminder that time didn't slow. No matter how dread thickened in the air, your fingers tightened around the worn haft of your tool, the grit of the wood rough against your skin, a small comfort in a world quickly unraveling. The cold mud underfoot sucked gently at your boots, as if the earth itself was reluctant to let you go, warning you to stay and face what was coming. Somewhere in the distance, a child's whimper broke through the murmurs, fragile yet piercing. The healer stepped forward, her eyes sharp and unyielding, despite the weight that bent her stooped shoulders. She lifted a battered satchel, laden with herbs whose green faded to brown in the damp air. Her voice, faint but resolute, cut through the murmuring crowd. Orders to boil water, to seal doors, to shield the children. How easily those words slipped past the dry lips, and yet carried the desperate will of those who refused to give in. The fire flickered weakly in the square, its orange glow a trembling heartbeat against the encroaching gray. You could almost taste the smoke, acrid and sour, wrapping the village in a choking embrace. Nearby, a mother tightened her shawl around a child who stared wide-eyed, clutching a tattered doll to her chest, as if it carried the power to ward away unseen horrors. A low moan of wind slid through the alleys, teasing the dripping thatch, stirring the scent of moss and rotten leaves. It was a bitter perfume now, laced with something coppery and sharp, the faint, undeniable odor of sickness creeping closer. You stepped slowly to the well, fingers brushing the cold stone rim as water sloshed faintly below. The thought of fetching clean water, once so mundane, now felt like a gambit with fate. Every drop drawn was a thread holding the village's fragile life together, even as dread gnawed at the edges of hope. A sudden shudder rippled through the crowd. From the forest came a murmur first, the rustle of branches cracked underfoot. A stumble, a breathless gasp carried on the wind. Eyes snapped toward the tree line, where shadows seemed to lengthen and shift with an unnatural urgency. The village dogs growled low and then fell abruptly silent, their absence a louder echo than any bark. Out of the mist stumbled a figure, a young man, his face pale and smeared with mud, eyes wild and glassy. His cloak hung heavily, soaked and torn, the weight of terror dragging his legs unevenly across the stones. He collapsed near the fire, gasping raggedly, the taste of desperation thick in the air. They They are inside the forest, he choked out, voice breaking like fragile twigs. The dead, not at rest, moving, no one left untouched. A stunned hush fell over the village. Words dropped like stones in a still pond. The old blacksmith's hammer slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the rough earth, and mothers held children tighter, swaddling them as if mere fabric could shield against such darkness. The chilly breeze that tangled in your hair carried a sharp new scent, something foul, colder than the damp and earth, a whisper of rot and decay that set your teeth on edge. The forest held its breath, waiting. You felt as if the shadow itself had paused, savoring the taste of fear that now marred the night. Drawing your cloak tighter, you stole a glance around. Faces looked back, fear, a flicker of determination, and beneath it all, a simmering panic barely concealed. The village was still, poised, on the thin edge between defiance and surrender. And then, as if the forest could no longer contain its hunger, a distant howl split the air. Not the wild cry of a lone wolf, but a long, ragged scream threading desperation and pain. It rolled and echoed, a dark song that settled like a chill down your spine. The old bell tolled once more, slow and agonizing, each clang reverberating through your chest. You gripped the well's stone rim again, knuckles white, heartbeat pounding, ready, somehow, to face the darkness looming just beyond the mist. Because tonight, the boundary between life and death wasn't measured in swords or stones, but in quiet breaths held beneath a sky that seemed less a witness and more an accomplice. And somewhere beyond that edge, in the blackened heart of the forest, something was moving. The lanterns along the village square flickered weakly, their flames a trembling chorus against the creeping dusk. The cold had settled deep now, seeping into your bones like a relentless shadow. The mist curled and hissed between cobblestones, swallowing your footsteps as you moved, pulled by a nervous gravity toward the clustered figures near the well. Your breath steamed in shallow bursts, the color of winter's reluctant breath drifting and dissolving into the chill. Faces around you, etched with fear and grim resolve, shifted toward one another in whispered circle, words too hushed to carry far, but loud enough to echo inside your chest. The healer's figure emerged once more, frail but unyielding, her hands carrying the weight of herbs and tinctures like fragile armor. She spoke again, this time more urgently, eyes burning past the thin veil of fog and fatigue. They needed to barricade doors, to gather what little clean water remained, before the well grew bitter with sickness. The village's lifeblood now hinged on cautious steps and whispered prayers. Nearby, a mother hunched low, rocking a small child whose lashes fluttered in restless sleep, disturbed dreams tangled in fevered whimpers. The ragged doll clenched in the child's hands looked almost sacred, a talisman against a world fraying faster than the delicate fabric of the cradle. You fingered the worn wood of your tool, its surface rough and familiar, the only steady companion amid a world unraveling. The weight in your grasp was no longer physical. It pressed with invisible fingers. A silent demand for strength you weren't sure you possessed. A sudden, distant crack echoed sharply, the sound of splintering wood, perhaps a branch breaking underfoot, or a hastily barred shutter catching in the wind. Heads snapped toward the noise, eyes wide and searching. The dogs, whose absence had grown deafening, did not bark. They only snarled quietly, shadows lurking in the spaces between the dark cottages. Movement flickered at the edge of the fog. A shape stumbled forward, bending low under some invisible burden. It was the trapper again, mud clinging to his tattered cloak, eyes flickering wildly as he gasped for breath. This time, the terror in his voice was raw, unraveling faster than words could contain. They're not just in the woods. They're inside the village now. The sick. They're moving. It's no longer waiting. The words landed like stones, hitting frozen earth, and a sudden hush swallowed the square. Mothers pulled children closer, the flicker of firelight dancing against trembling faces carved in shadow. Even the old blacksmith sank lower, fingers curling tightly around a hammer that had forged more than iron. It was a talisman against darkness, now feeling useless as ash. The bitter chill settled like a veil, heavier than ever. You felt it in the tightening in your chest, the sharp, metallic taste that crowded your mouth. The scent of decay drifted closer, a distasteful perfume layered atop the earth's damp breath. Something fouler, deeper, whispering of rot and sickened roots beneath your feet. From the forest edge came another howl, lower, deeper, strangled like a cough through gnarled throat. It was not the cry of wild beasts, but something shifted, something unnatural, clawing through the mist, a sound that pressed against your ears and stirred ancient, buried fears. The bell tolled yet again, the heavy clang echoing through the narrow alleyways and empty windows. Each stroke was a heartbeat lost, a slow count toward an unknown reckoning. And then a steady beating began, a rhythm, faint at first, then growing, the tramp of hurried feet, the clatter of tools dropped, the whispered prayers rising as a chorus beneath the cold sky. The village was moving, galvanized by a fragile hope, fearing the night, but refusing to be swallowed by it. Your eyes locked on the child, clutching a chipped cross, her gaze unyielding, steel, forged in the crucible of dread. In that moment, the flicker of firelight caught in her eyes was more than defiance. It was the fragile promise of dawn, stubborn as the weeds growing between cracked stones. Yet the night was patient. The mist thickened, coiling around your ankles like a serpent, ready to strike. The walls that once promised shelter now felt brittle, permeable membranes barely holding the dark at bay. You forced your legs to move forward, toward the boundary where the village met the forest, a line that blurred in the damp gloom. Every step felt heavier, the earth beneath seeming to pulse faintly with something alive and hungry. A sudden cracking sound split the air, sharp and inexplicable. Something breaking free, or perhaps breaking in. Your heart hammered as the torchlight danced, casting grotesque shapes that writhed and twisted with each flicker. The silence stretched taut, waiting, listening. And then, just beyond the veil of fog, something moved. Not a shadow, not a whisper. A hand reached out, pale and trembling, clawing through the mist like a herald of what was to come. The mist curled tighter now, thickening into a cloak that wrapped the village in a deeper silence, as if the very air had decided to hold its breath in terror. Your feet pressed into the sodden earth, every step muted by the cold mud clinging stubbornly to your boots. Above, the lantern's pale flames swung faintly, shadows leaping and flickering across the shuttered windows and cracked walls, painting illusory shapes that seemed to pause and watch. You felt the pulse of the village beat faint and irregular, an anxious rhythm threading through the tight clusters of faces, drawn close in the square. Eyes, wide and glimmering with desperation, tracked every shifting silhouette at the fog's edge. The old bell tolled once more, its heavy clang a dirge rolling over the damp stones and settling in your bones like a cold hand. Hands clenched tools, now more out of superstition than hope. Your own fingers tightened around the rough wood, worn smooth by years of labor, but now rough enough to bite into your skin. It was no longer just a weapon or a tool. It was a talisman, suspended between your will to fight and the creeping dread seeping into every breath. A gust stirred the smoke from the smoldering fire pit, carrying sharp scents, damp earth, smoldered herbs, and something far fouler, an iron tang that made your tongue itch and your chest tighten. You looked to the gathering crowd and saw the healer's silhouette, stooped but resolute. Her hands moved calmly among pots and bundles of dried black and green leaves, a ritual against the invisible swarm closing in. The child beside you, clutching their chipped wooden cross, shivered, not from cold alone. Their eyes, vast and unblinking, burned with a quiet defiance that stubbornly pushed against the suffocating gloom. You brushed a damp strand of hair away, feeling the fragile warmth of the small life against the encroaching decay. Suddenly, from the edge of the square, a fierce barking broke through the taut quiet, a rough, raw sound that cut through the mist like a blade. You turned sharply, breath caught, heart lurching. From where the fog swallowed the twisted silhouettes of the woods, a figure stumbled forward, dragging feet heavy and labored across slick cobblestones. The village trapper, mud streaking his pale face, eyes wild and unfocused, collapsed near the fire. He gasped for breath, choking on words thick with the taste of despair. His voice cracked as he rasped out the truth that shattered the fragile semblance of safety. They moved past the trees, inside the village now. No rest, no mercy. A hush fell, deeper than before, as the fire flickered in trembling hands. Mothers pulled children closer, huddling them as if sheer will could stave off what came in creeping shadows. The old blacksmith's hammer slipped noiselessly to the ground. The clatter swallowed by the thickening fog. You swallowed hard, the metallic bitterness rising in your throat, and stared toward the dark woods, black as spilled ink. A low growl vibrated beneath the surface, a guttural, unnatural sound twisting the night itself. It was no beast's call. It was a slow, dragging moan, scraping along bone and earth, a lament and a threat braided together. An icy gust swept past, carrying the sickly sweet stench of rot and death. It clung to the leaves, the wet earth, saturating the air with a poison that tightened your chest and made your skin crawl. The scent of something not wholly dead, crawling just beneath the surface. The villagers whispered prayers, wove through the mist, thin and fragile as spider silk. The fire sputtered, the flame trembling as if it too feared to burn too bright against the gathering dark. You felt the weight of countless eyes upon you, the silent question of what you would do when the shadow crossed the threshold. Suddenly, footsteps pounded, thudding like war drums against stones slick with rain. The crowd tensed, bodies stiffened as a line of figures emerged from the fog. Neighbors, friends, armed with hastily gathered weapons, pitchforks, knives, pots knocked from kitchens, turned battle drums. Faces set like stone, eyes flickering with fear and fierce resolve. You stepped forward, shoulders squared, the familiar roughness of your tool grounding you. Behind you, the child still clung to the chipped cross, eyes flashing with a courage too young to understand the cost. The forest's edge seemed to pulse, shadows, twisting and marring beneath the pale moon, a breath away from swallowing the trembling village whole. A final howl shattered the night, a ragged, climbing wail that twisted into a chorus of whispered terrors. Then, in the brittle hush that followed, emerging from the mist like something half remembered in a nightmare, a single hand reached out, pale, trembling, and clawing against the creeping fog. The night exhaled slowly, and you realized the calm before the storm was over. The night had thickened its grip, folding the village deeper into a cold embrace, the mist wrapping like a shroud too stubborn to lift. You could barely see your own breath now, just fleeting ghosts, lost among the drifting fog. The pale flames from the lanterns dangled like flickering sentinels, casting long, uncertain shadows that stumbled and merged with the darkness between the crooked houses. Each breath you drew tasted sharper, tinged with the acrid tang of smoke and earth, but also something fouler beneath it all, an iron-like scent crawling beneath your skin, setting your nerves jangling. The ground beneath your boots was slick and unsteady, the mud clinging like a warning from the earth itself. Somewhere close, the whisper of dry leaves brushed against stone walls, as if the forest was inching closer, hungry and restless. Around you, the village held its collective breath. Faces tightened in grim silence, pressed close to the weak flames, as if their warmth might hold back the gathering dread. The old healer moved with quiet purpose, adjusting the wounds of the barely breathing trapper, her hands trembling only slightly as she worked against the tick of time narrowing around the village like noose tightening. A mother rocked her child wrapped in threadbare cloth, her eyes glassy but fierce, refusing to let the tears fall. The child's small hands gripped a faded cross, hope carved out of desperation. That tiny light, stubborn and unyielding, was a fragile beacon in the thickening dark. You tried to steady yourself, the coarse wood of your tool rough in your grasp, grounding your racing mind. It wasn't just weight, it was a silent plea for resistance, a promise to stand when all else seemed to falter. Time slithered in slow arcs, each slugging second a reminder of everything slipping away. Suddenly, a harsh wind tore through the square, rattling the shutters and stirring the brittle. Remnants of last season's leaves. The stench of decay grew stronger, more immediate, like a hidden wound breathing in your face. Every nose twitched, every eye lifted to the twisted outline of the woods looming at the village's edge, black and immovable as a stone sentinel defying dawn. Then a sharp, splintering crack shattered the fragile quiet, mingling with a guttural, animalistic growl that raised the hairs on your neck. A sound unnatural and desperate, scraping the very edges of sanity. The village dogs, silent all night, answered with low snarls that faded too quickly, as if retreating from something impossible to face. Your heart hammered, each beat a frantic echo, pounding against ribs already tight with fear. The crowd tightened instinctively, bodies inching closer, clinging to a threadbare sense of safety. As the darkness folded in, mothers covered ears and whispered urgent prayers. The old blacksmith's fingers clenched his hammer until knuckles paled. But even that familiar weight seemed suddenly feeble. From the fogged periphery came movement, slow, deliberate, and terrifying. A pale hand, trembling and clawed, emerged first, scraping against the cold stones like a broken promise. Eyes held there, hollow, soulless eyes that reflected nothing but the void, the air itself, seemed to twist, sucked dry of warmth. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered villagers, a fragile shudder threading quickly from heart to heart. The child at your side tightened her grip on the wooden cross, her young face drawn taut in silent defiance. That flicker of courage, so fragile and raw, momentarily held the cold shadow at bay. But the hand was just the beginning. Another appeared, then another, emerging slowly, inevitability itself taking shape in the fog. The ragged forms shuffled forward, a grotesque parody of life, dragging decay and despair in their wake. The scent of rot deepened, clawing its way into your lungs with every breath, thick and suffocating. The air filled with a low, dreadful murmur, not the voice of the living, but a sound that grated beneath the skin. The drumming rhythm of countless footsteps, unsteady but unyielding, closed the distance. The village's fragile walls seemed to tremble as the darkness pressed harder, unrelenting and raw. A trembling hand gripped your shoulder, warm and fleeting, a whisper of the life you once held casually, now precious and precarious. You met the gaze of the elder, his eyes fierce despite exhaustion, wordless communication passing like a spark. This was the moment everyone feared, but none had dared name. And then, as if the sky itself could no longer bear witness silently, the old bell tolled once more. Its mournful clang split the night air, a sharp counterpoint to the slow march of dread advancing just beyond the flickering firelight. You swallowed, heart hammering in your throat, rain beginning to fall softly, the first cold drops pattering against your cloak like hollow drumbeats. The mist with horror, others narrowed in stubborn resolve. The line between fear and courage blurred in the cold, fragile breath of dawn, still hours away. And just as the cold rain began to soak through the fire's last flickering embers, a long, ragged howl rose from the forest, a sound torn from the throat of despair and sharpened with hunger. It echoed, stretched, and twisted through the fog, wrapping itself around every soul standing frozen on the edge of oblivion. And then, as silence swallowed the last echo, you felt it, a slow, heavy step, falling carefully beyond the mist, just out of sight, but impossible to ignore, heralding that what was once waiting had now begun to move. The first light of dawn seeped reluctantly through heavy clouds, a pale wash of gray that softened the village's harsh angles and dulled the edges of fear that had gripped every heart. The mist, once thick and suffocating, now thinned like an exhaled breath, retreating slowly as the sun promised a new day. The village stirred with a cautious calm, fragile but undeniable, a whispered truce between the living and the shadowed night that had just passed. The ragged forms that had threatened to consume your home lay silent now, Still as the stones beneath them, the eerie groans and whispered moans that had filled the air were gone, replaced by the muffled calls of distant birds and the gentle rustle of wind in awakening trees. The forest's edge no longer loomed as a predator, but stood watchful and quiet, an ancient sentinel, tired of the night's fury. You lowered your hand from the well's cold stone, the rough surface cool and steady beneath your palm. Around you, the villagers emerged from their shattered slumber, not with the frantic haste of survival, but with the slow, deliberate movements of those who had weathered a storm and lived to see the sun rise again. Mothers gathered their children, eyes red but sparkled faintly with relief. The elder's gaze met yours. A silent nod passing between you, scarred by what had been endured, yet resilient. The healer's hands, now steadier, moved through the crowd, tending to those weakened but alive. Her worn satchel, once heavy with dried herbs, seemed lighter in the day's gentle light. Her voice, soft but steadfast, wove reassurance into trembling spirits, reminding all that healing, like hope, flourished in the quiet persistence of care and patience. Around the square, the scent that had once carried rot and despair had lifted, replaced by the faint, sweet aroma of damp earth warming beneath the sun's gentle reach. The fire pit still smoldered faintly, smoke coiling upward like a weary sigh. Its flames had not died completely. They had only held back, waiting for this moment to reignite the heart of the village. You glanced down at your tool, worn but unbroken, its surface catching the tentative light. It was no longer just an instrument of labor or defense, but a symbol, a testament to enduring harsh days and darker nights, and to standing resolute when all seemed lost. As you rose, shoulders easing from the tension of endless vigilance, a quiet strength settled inside you, steady and sure. Children's laughter, tentative at first, began to weave through the alleyways. It rippled softly, fragile as new leaves unfurling after a harsh winter. From behind crooked doors and shuttered windows, familiar faces appeared, worn but unmistakably yours. The same neighbors who had shared jokes by the fire, who had braved the biting cold, and faced terror not with swords or shields, but with shared breath and unspoken courage. You felt the warmth return, not just from the shrinking cold, but from the simple truth that together you had held firm. The village, imperfect and battered, stood, not as a fortress against the world, but as a home that bore its scars with quiet dignity. The old bell, silent through the night's chaos, rang out once again, its clear, steady tone threading through the morning air. It was not a toll of warning, but a call to life, a remembrance of trials faced and the fragile peace earned. The sound settled deep, a pulse weaving through your very being, a beat that matched the slow, sure rhythm of a heart ready to mend. Beyond the village, the forest seemed to breathe beneath the awakening sun, shadows retreating from the tender touch of light. The howls that had haunted the edges faded into memory, absorbed by time and distance. Nature reclaimed its quiet dominion, carrying away the faint traces of dread like leaves floating down a calm stream. You took a slow breath, drawing in the cool morning air, tasting the faint hint of wildflowers and fresh grass. A subtle salute from a world that, despite its brutality, still offered moments of grace. Around you, villagers began to gather near the hearths once more, exchanging tired smiles that spoke of survival and solidarity, a shared promise to carry forward. The child beside you, clutching her chipped wooden cross, looked up with eyes no longer shadowed by fear, but bright with wary hope. Her small hand slipped into yours, a fragile anchor in this new dawn. Together, you face the path ahead, not unscarred, but unbroken. The sky lightened steadily, the heavy clouds dissolving into a soft blue that stretched wide and endless overhead. A stray breeze stirred, carrying with it the scent of rain yet to fall, a gentle reminder of cycles enduring beyond human strife, the steady pulse of seasons, of life reborn. As the village exhaled with the morning, you let yourself lean into the calm, the quiet hum of peace settling like a soft blanket. The earth beneath your feet was firm once more, the mist retreating into memory. And as you stood there, surrounded by the first warm rays touching familiar stones, you understood this story was closing, not with a shout or a clash, but with the gentle turning of pages, the slow settling of dust after a long storm. The village would go on. The nights would still bring shadows, and the days their toils. But for now, there was rest, a fragile, earned rest, and beneath that, a promise whispered by the dawn itself. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the chance to live again.